Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is Friday, January 24th. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the spring camp, get into a couple of teams from each conference that you're going to want to watch very closely. We'll probably continue this going into next week, a couple more teams that I want to get on this list, but wanted to make sure I got my initial thoughts out pretty early. Then we'll get to my All-American team for 2024. We'll get to all the players, and then I'll do a couple of position groups as we go through this thing, give my linebacker group of the year, defensive tackle, edge rushing, all of that type of stuff throughout this thing. Then we'll get to the top 10 quarterbacks and heading into 2025. Very tough list to put together, but the 10 that I have here I feel are pretty solidly in the top 10, but definitely up for debate just a little bit. We'll get to a transfer portal update, kind of the last one that we'll do, at least in full form. A lot of different things that have happened over the last week, including kind of the national title fallout. Notre Dame has lost a couple of players that we're going to have to talk about here. And then weekend wrap-up, just kind of all the things that have already happened throughout this week. Al Golden gets hired away from Notre Dame to Cincinnati, and a couple different things that we're going to want to talk about. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any comment, a question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have, and we can have a fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that and we can have fun back and forth and talk about whatever y'all want to talk about. And we'll start with the spring games. We'll start with the spring camp that is going to happen really pretty soon. I think Hawaii starts in a couple of days here, actually, but there's definitely some big-time storylines as we head into spring and some big-time teams you're going to want to watch. So we'll kind of do what we did yesterday with the sleepers, go 2 teams every conference, and we'll probably carry this over into next week. There's definitely some things I want to talk about with some other teams I didn't have a chance to get into here, but let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and we'll start in the SEC, and we'll start with the team that's going to steal a lot of headlines, and that's the Texas Longhorns with Arch Manning. Obviously, is going to be a huge role in this, in the spring camp, and how we kind of contextualize it. He's going to have to take a huge step forward in terms of leadership. You know, Quinn Ewers was outright the motor of this team. He was the heart of this team. He was the leader, and it definitely puts you in a little bit of a disadvantage. You know, Arch Manning's got to come in there, and he's got to be ready to roll, and then the wide receiver group has to step up in a big way. Lots of young talent that I very much like. Ryan Wingo probably main among them. Khalil Lockett and Jamie French coming in as freshmen. Very talented group. It could be that they just don't pick up anyone, and you'll find out pretty much at the end of spring if they've done their job, if they stepped up in the way that they expected, or if they kind of fell back from the pack a little bit more than Texas would have wanted. And then the other group is the offensive line. You know, you lose 4 starters, tons of talent and depth on that team, no doubt about it, but definitely you're going to need some guys to step up, and the spring portal, again, could inform us where they are in that group, because definitely a very talented group. Definitely a group that could use some reinforcements, and we'll actually talk about that when we get into the transfer portal, because I think there's one of those Notre Dame guys that they could be very well in for. But very talented group, there's no doubt about that. I think throughout spring, we're just going to have to see how the early returns on Arch Manning are. You have to assume they're going to be pretty good, because they've been good for the last couple of years, but definitely going to be interesting to watch the periphery. You know, how are the wide receivers playing? How's the offensive line going in? A lot of different little things with all those players kind of walking out the door to the NFL. And then South Carolina. I think this is a team that everyone's going to want to watch as we head into 2025. You have Lenore Sellers. 2025 is going to be a huge year for him, and the sky-high expectations are going to come with that. It's going to be really awesome to see what happens with that, but the real question that I have is on the defensive side of the ball. You know, you lose a guy like Kyle Kennard, you lose a guy like TJ Sanders, and you're looking up and you don't necessarily have the defensive line that you had a year ago. That was a huge motor for what they were able to do, but at the end of the day, you do have Dylan Stewart, you do have a couple other guys that can make some big-time plays. It's going to be a little bit of a patch job. On the defensive side of the ball, you're going to have big guys step up, and then Dylan Stewart's going to have to be the absolute game wrecker that he's capable of being. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in the portal in spring. Maybe they pick up a couple more defenders that kind of to shore up their back end. I think Nick Emanwari leaving is a huge hit, but you do have Kilgore back. Definitely some very good talent on that defense, but some things you're going to have to patch, especially on that front 4, and we'll see if they can do that, and we'll see what they do in spring that could kind of inform how far along they are at that position. Moving over to the Big Ten, you do have Indiana. You know, you're out with Curtis Rourke, you're in with Fernando Mendoza, and you got to be ready to roll. There's no doubt about that. Curtis Rourke was a fantastic player on the field, but he was also a huge leader for this team off the field. He was a guy that definitely put them in a great position to win, and a lot of these guys were more than willing to follow him into the fire. So I think Fernando Mendoza has to be the same guy. He's obviously come off as that guy when he was at Cal. It's going to be a whole new battle, no doubt about that. Walking into the Big Ten, playing for a program that just went to the CFP, you know what they want to do. So that's going to be a lot of pressure on him. We'll see how he reacts to that. And then a lot of players just kind of making their way out. After coming over from JMU, they're probably making their way to the league. Some that have a couple more years, but a couple that are finding their way off. And still plenty of talent on this roster, but some young players will have to step up for this team. Some new transfers will have to step up for this team. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Really like where this team is at, but that Fernando Mendoza piece is going to be huge as we head into spring. Penn State is obviously going to be one you're going to want to watch, and the reality is you've been put on the pedestal by the way too early rankings. Kind of the same thing with Texas and Arch Manning. You got to deliver. One way or the other, you have to find a way to win a ton of games, and Drew Aller is in a position where you got to continue to take strides and maybe take a big-time stride this upcoming year, because this past year, while it was good, while you took that step forward, wasn't quite the step forward that a lot of people expected, wasn't quite as good against those elite defenses that he played throughout the year. So definitely a guy that needs to step up. And then you do have the wide receiver group. That's always going to be a big question at Penn State until they get figured out. Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross come in from the portal, and you got to get early returns on those guys. If you don't, you have to dip back in during spring. I probably think they're going to do that anyway, if I'm being honest, but I do think there's a little bit of an opening where you got to get that figured out. And if Kyron Hudson can step up huge during spring practice, then maybe you have a little bit more comfort in your pass game going into 2025. And then on defense, they return tons of talent. I'm not overly worried about those guys, but losing a guy like Abdul Carter is huge. Losing a guy like Jalen Reed on the back end is huge. So replacing those guys is not going to be easy. Will be interesting to see who steps up. I know it's going to be Denai Dennis Sutton in the edge rushing department, but in the back end, it's going to be huge to see who steps up into that position and who kind of takes the charge. Zakee Wheatley would be the number one pick, but definitely some other guys that have to step up huge. Over to the Big 12, and I think you have to go with Texas Tech here to start. This is a team that is very, very easy to watch, and definitely a team where you get into the offseason and the portal just blows up for them. They make play after play. They get big-time players into that program, and really on the defensive side of the ball most aggressively, but a lot of very good offensive players coming into this team as well. You're keeping a couple of players. Micah Hudson might be coming back from A&M. A lot of different things happening around this Texas Tech program, but for me, it's Baron Morton. I think he's a guy that I really liked going in this 2025 season, or 2024 season, excuse me. Didn't quite hit the strides that I was expecting from him, but easily should be a top Big 12 quarterback as you head into 2025, and definitely a guy that needs to take big-time steps forward. I also think, this portal class that you brought in, Romello Height, Lee Hunter, and a ton of other guys, you're going to have to find a way to get those guys rolling early. Now, they're plenty talented. I don't think that's going to be a worry for you guys, but at the end of the day, you want to walk into the next season playing your best football, because as we all know, the Big 12 can get sideways in a hurry, and you lose a couple of games early in the season, it's a hole that's going to be really hard to dig yourself out of. So definitely a really interesting team to watch. One team that I think when you look forward to 2025 and really beyond, I think it's a program that could have some real success over the next 5 or 10 years. But at the end of the day, you need that kickstart. You need the one season that really gets everything rolling downhill. This is probably going to be that season for Texas Tech if they're going to get it done. Definitely going to be something to watch, and a team that I really like going into this year. Also a team that has some questions as we head into next year. Houston is a team that I'm really interested in, more just kind of a pet project more than anything else, but you do bring in Connor Wegman to play quarterback behind Willie Fritz, and I think it's a really, really good concept. I think that duo is definitely going to work out very, very well. Won't necessarily bring the running ability that some of the other players that he's had did bring, but at the end of the day, very talented passer, and I think they've done a great job in the portal defensively. You bring in a guy like Dean Connors over from Rice, you bring Keontae Scott over from Auburn. I think they're both very nice pickups. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting this team to light the world on fire, be a top 25 or even a playoff team in 2025, but I do think there's an opening here. I do think there's an ability for the Big 12 to go a little bit crazy next year. Maybe Arizona State doesn't play quite as well as football as they did this year. Maybe BYU takes a step back, and then the void is there for someone to step up into that, and I don't necessarily think Houston's going to get to the CFP next year. I do think they could be a team that you line up in front of them on a Saturday and you find out that your season's essentially ended because they've beaten you in the middle of November or something like that. Over in the ACC, I think we got to talk about Pitt. You have Eli Holstein, you have Pitt that are coming off a year that just turned on a dime on them. You had 7-0 and then 7-6 in a hurry, and I'm sure it felt that way for those players. You know, he had the injury to Eli Holstein. He also struggled in a couple of those games down the stretch, and you look forward to 2025. Tons of defensive talent. There's no doubt about that. Very veteran, very smart group coming back. And then you have someone like Desmond Reed leading the way on the offensive side of the ball. It should be a good team. I feel pretty confident that this should be a team that is very formidable in 2025, but they want to take that step forward. You know, they don't want to just be a team that halfway through the year is a fun story. They want to be the team that makes it to the CFP instead of an SMU team. So that's going to be something interesting to watch. Love what Eli Holstein brings to that team, but he needs to take that step forward, and this whole team needs to take that little step forward going into 2025. And then Miami. This is the one for me. This is the one that I think is the most interesting, and Carson Beck is a huge piece of that. You know, that injury is going to be really interesting to watch throughout spring, but I'm also really focused on Emory Williams. I think he's a guy that you're probably going to have step in some pretty big moments throughout this year. I think there's going to be moments where you really have to have that guy step in, make some big-time throws. We'll find out in spring how long he is, definitely just where he is, how confident he is going into next year. And then you do have Corey Heatherman coming in from Minnesota. Going to be really interesting to hear the early returns on that group and see a group that I really have high hopes for. I really like the defensive talent that they brought in, but definitely still a group that you have some questions about. So I think it's going to be a great team, but I think the questions in spring are very, very real. I think you look at Carson Beck and you say, that's definitely the biggest question, no doubt about that, but you need a little bit of a fail-safe. And Emory Williams, he's going to have to take a big-time step forward. And then Miami, you got to get that defense moving forward. You got to get that defense where it should be in terms of talent, and definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch. And overall, I think when you go throughout spring camp, it's always hard to get a beat on some of these teams. You have kind of a zero-sum game because you're playing against one another, and you don't really know which is great, which is not so good, if they're just two elite units, if they're two terrible units. So it'll be interesting to watch this unfold. But the reality is a lot of teams become contenders. A lot of teams kind of fall out of the mix during this time of year because it's a lot of change. It's a lot of different things going on, and it'll be a really interesting thing to watch as we move into spring, and definitely some more teams that I'll talk about likely next week. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, I'll get in my 2024 All-American team, get to all the players that I have, and then I'll do a couple of groups, you know, some teams that just have the best wide receiver group or the best defensive tackle group or things like that. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the teams I'm going to be watching very closely as we head into spring camp. Definitely some very interesting teams. Texas probably leads that charge with Arch Manning, so definitely going to be interesting to watch them along with a lot of other teams around the country. But let's get into my 2024 postseason All-American team because there's a lot of guys on here, and there's definitely some guys that made their way on here during the CFP, some guys that didn't necessarily make their way on there but got very, very close to possibly getting on here. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and I will give some groups as we go through this, you know, the best running back group, best wide receiver group, kind of around that nature as we go through this thing, but definitely wanted to highlight some players because probably the last time that we'll really get into the 2024 season. We'll probably leave it behind as we head into next week, and definitely wanted to give some love to some big-time players before we did that. But the quarterback is Cam Ward. I don't know if that needs to be said. He was the best quarterback in the country. Shedeur Sanders, Dylan Gabriel, they were close. At the end of the day, this was the best quarterback. Now, Will Howard went on a run that was very close to what Cam Ward was able to do throughout this year, but overall, that was the best offense in the country. That was the guy that was the most dangerous, and it wasn't necessarily because the elite athleticism or anything crazy. It was because he was way too calm in that pocket. He was a guy that would stand flat-footed and then throw a ball 40 yards downfield. Very talented guy. He moves forward to the NFL draft, and I'll give out my top 10 picks for the quarterbacks a little later in the next week. Probably do maybe a whole day where I just go kind of through the draft and give you guys some early thoughts on that. But overall, this is probably my number one quarterback. This is a guy that I think could be the number one pick overall, and definitely an incredible player to watch at Miami. One that I think Miami is going to regret leaving without getting him to the CFP. But at the end of the day, very talented quarterback, and obviously had the best year from quarterbacks as far as I'm concerned. The duo of running backs here, Ashton Jeanty and Cam Skattebo, about as easy as you can possibly do it, if I'm being totally honest. Ashton Jeanty ended second in the Heisman, almost broke Barry Sanders' record that stood for decades, and then Cam Skattebo probably should have been in New York City, if I'm being totally honest. Not a huge gap between him and number 4, but at the end of the day, Skattebo did give us the best CFP performance of the year. Ashton Jeanty gave a number of best individual performances throughout this year. So, remarkable group here, no doubt about that. I think you have running backs. I think you got to go with the group of Ohio State. If you're going to go with a room overall, I think you got to go with Ohio State with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. But these two guys were really setting the pace for this year, and it was remarkable to watch these two guys kind of burst onto the scene. For wide receivers, I went a little bit different in this one than I thought I would have, at least coming out of the regular season than I definitely would have, and I added Jeremiah Smith into this group. But Nick Nash was absolutely incredible. Was the leading receiver in the FBS this year. Was a guy that I think is going to be special at the next level. He has such a good body control, such an ability to catch passes that are just anywhere near him. Very talented kid. Cannot wait to see what he can do at the next level. And then you do have Travis Hunter playing some great football. Obviously, a guy that did some great things. I don't necessarily think he should have been, Biletnikoff level, but very talented player nonetheless, and obviously a guy that we expect to possibly go number 1 overall as well. And then Jeremiah Smith, the guy that would go number 1 overall in this draft if he was eligible. Incredibly talented kid. Made the play of the CFP in a lot of different ways with that catch at the very end, and definitely a guy that's going to be awesome to watch throughout this year. I think you got to go with the group of Ohio State. If you're going to go with just a room of wide receivers, very hard to beat what Ohio State has. Now, I think Texas, Oregon get a little bit close, but what Ohio State has in that room is just different in every sense of the word. But those are my wide receivers. Love this trio that we had, and I move forward to tight ends. I'm going to go with Harold Fannin. I think this is the best tight end in the country this year. I don't think it was a very big gap between him and Tyler Warren, obviously. Two very elite guys, and cannot wait to see what happens in the NFL draft process for this kid. He's a very fun player, not necessarily the most elite blocker in the world, so definitely something that he's going to have to figure out as he heads to the next level, but he was incredible all the way throughout the year. Was one of the most elite pass catchers in the country, was second in receiving yards right behind Nick Nash, so very talented player. This was the guy that I was drawn to the most throughout this year. Now, Tyler Warren is no slouch. I'm not necessarily saying there's a huge gap between these two. I think it's about as close as any position that I had to do, but at the end of the day, I leaned a little bit more towards Harold Fannin. Was incredible this year, and really, I think he's going to be an awesome NFL player. And then for the offensive line, I went for a group. I didn't necessarily go for individual positions. There were definitely some guys I could call out, like Will Campbell, like Kelvin Banks, like all those big-time guys. But at the end of it, Seth McLaughlin over at Ohio State, another one. But Oregon is the team that I'm going to kind of peg here as the best offensive line in the country. I think there's a lot of different guys that played some really great football. The tackles in Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly are about as elite as you're going to find across the country. And you have Matthew Bedford in the middle that if they had him in, they were going to run the ball very effectively. Very good group, and definitely a group that just continuously got better throughout the year. About 3 or 4 of those guys are going to get drafted this time in April. And then you got the defensive tackles, Mason Graham and Walter Nolan, two guys that really set themselves apart throughout this year. I thought about putting one of those Ohio State guys in here, but at the end of the day, this duo is absolutely incredible. And I think you look at Mason Graham, he's kind of a true, can't-miss guy. I think he's a guy that he's one of those that he's not going to bust. He's not going to be a guy that misses in the NFL. He's going to be a guy that really succeeds because he's just elite in every sense of the word. Can be one of the best run-stuffing defensive tackles you've seen, but also can get after the quarterback in a way that a guy that size should just not be able to do. So, remarkable stuff from him. And then Walter Nolan, as athletic as can be, and the ceiling is still very much above him. One of those guys that I think could really burst onto the scene in the right situation in the NFL. So, really love this duo. I think when you're talking about a group, it's really hard to beat what Michigan has with Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. I think Texas did a great job with their group after two guys went off to the NFL, and they'll have to do it again, as will Michigan. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. But these two these two defensive tackles were downright elite in every sense of the word, and these guys are going to be monsters at the next level. The edge rushing was a little bit tougher, but I think you got to go with Kyle Kennard. I think you got to go with Abdul Carter. Now, there were definitely some players in the back half of the season, Jack Sawyer in that CFP race, that made me think about sliding him in here, maybe JTT in here. But at the end of the day, Kyle Kennard put on a show this year. He was absolutely incredible all the way throughout the year, was a guy that I think in a lot of ways should have won the Bednarik over Travis Hunter, so very, very talented guy, totally a game wrecker, and cannot wait to see what he does at the next level. A little bit more raw than some of these other guys, but definitely a guy that could really explode onto the scene in the next couple of years. And then Abdul Carter, a true freak of nature, a guy that when you see him on the football field, you don't fully understand how he's doing what he's doing, but at the end of the day, it's going to be awesome to see what he can do throughout this year, and definitely a guy that I think whoever gets him in the NFL draft, if he goes number one overall, I have no problem with that. Tennessee Titans, congratulations, you got an absolute freak. So I do think this is a guy that's really going to make a lot of people turn their heads during the draft, and he's one of those guys that sounds like he wants to go to the Eagles. He's not going to be remotely on the board by the time the Eagles are ready to pick. So going to be an interesting player to watch. Definitely a guy that I really like, and one of those guys that I think you can fit him for a gold jacket right about now and just have to hold on to it for a couple of years. The linebacking group was very tough to put together as well, because I think there were a lot of linebackers around that kind of even 10 group that were very, very tough to rank, but I do have Anthony Hill, Jalen Walker, and Danny Stutzman as my group out here. Would be a nasty group. There's no doubt about that. Anthony Hill all over the place on the defensive side of the ball, can rush the passer kind of like Jalen Walker, who that's really his kind of attribute. That's the thing that he does the best, but he can fly around the field. He can cover people when you very much need him to, and then Danny Stutzman is one of the most consistent products you have ever seen in college football in the last 10 years, if I'm being totally honest. He is as good of a run defender as you're going to find in college football history. He is so good at filling gaps, at making sure he's in the right place, but overall, this group is absolutely incredible. When you're looking at the group that I would go with from the linebackers, I think you got to go with Notre Dame. You're led by Jack Kaiser, you have Jaden Osbury, you have a number of other guys in that group, you have Drake Bowen, who made a great play in the national title, some really, really talented players in that group. No individuals outdid this group, but overall, if you're taking a group of linebackers, I think you got to go up there to South Bend, Indiana. Cornerbacks, very tough group to put together, but I think Noah Williams is one of the more underrated guys throughout this year. Had 7 INTs this year and gave Cal some big-time chances throughout the year that they probably wouldn't have had if he was not on that team. Very talented player, and then you got Jahdae Barron. Won the Thorpe. He definitely should have won the Thorpe. An absolute beast, a freak of nature, and definitely a guy that was as elite in coverage as he was in run help. Definitely going to be a guy that I think goes in the first round in the NFL draft, and it'll be really awesome to watch what unfolds in that one. I think if you're going for a collection of cornerbacks, if you're going for a room, I think you're going to be hard to beat Texas. Now, Notre Dame would be very close, in my opinion, with Leonard Moore, with Christian Gray, with a lot of these guys. But Jahdae Barron, Malik Muhammad, Jalen Gilbo, you have... I'm blanking on the name right now, but a very talented group over there at Texas, and I think we were talking about cornerbacks. Very hard to beat this group right here. I think these two are absolutely incredible throughout this year, and Noah Williams is one of those guys that we'll probably forget as we head into next year, but we definitely shouldn't. He's a very talented guy and definitely could continue that rise as we head into 2025. The safeties are about as easy as can be. If I'm being totally honest with you, they were the two best safeties in the CFP. They were the two best safeties this entire year. Now, Malachi, why am I blanking on his name? Malachi Starks, from Georgia, played an incredible season, but overall, I think you got to go with these two. These two were absolutely incredible, and we get to see Caleb Downs for at least one more year in college football. Almost definitely one more year in college football, so that's going to be awesome to watch, but easily. I think if you're picking a group, I think you have to go with Ohio State. You add Latham Ransom to Caleb Downs, and it's about as good as you can possibly imagine. But overall, I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how that all unfolds. And these two are about as elite as you're going to find at that safety position all around the country. So downright elite, and these two guys are the two best guys in the country as far as I'm concerned. And Anthony, you're absolutely right. I think that linebacker group give me a little bit of versatility more than anything else. Danny Stutzman obviously leads the group, no doubt about that, but I do think you have Anthony Hill and Jalen Walker just kind of freaks on the outside that can make all types of plays. But moving on to the coaching staff, because I wanted to give some love here as well, Shannon Dawson did a remarkable job at offensive coordinator this year, led the best offense in the country, and now gets one of the best processors in the sport, and Carson Beck going into next year. Going to be really interesting to see what he can do with that group. But what he did with this group this year was just downright special, and Cam Ward was obviously at the center of that. The defensive coordinator, Jim Knowles, I would have him as my pick as the Royals Award right now as the best assistant in the country. He was downright incredible, and he had all the talent in the world, no doubt about that, but you would have thought this was the All-American team alone. You would have thought that was the All-American defense all across that thing, the way they were playing late in the season. He was downright elite and did an incredible job throughout this year. And then Marcus Freeman's my head coach. Now, I could go with Ryan Day here, and I think it's very, very close, but the job that he's done throughout this year has been incredibly tough. You lose to a team like NIU, you have USC, you have Louisville, you have all these teams waiting on deck to take you off, to kind of cut the head off the dragon and be the team that ended Notre Dame's chances. And the CFP, no one was able to do it. You need to have a great leader to find your way through 12, 14 games that they had to play after that and find a way to win a lot of those games. It was all this guy. It was the guy that was leading the way in a lot of ways. And then Xavier Watts, Riley Mills, all the guys leading in that locker room. It was a remarkable, remarkable team. You hear guys talk about this group and they say it's one of the most special groups that I've ever been able to cover because of how connected they were. And it started up top with that guy. Remarkable, remarkable head coach, and cannot wait to see what he does the next couple of years, because it could be a very special time for Notre Dame as you move forward, because that guy is downright special. But overall, I think you look at All-American teams and you're going to have some guys that are all over the place. I think that tight end group is very hard to pick from. I think the cornerback group is very hard to pick from. But overall, pretty much like the group that I ended with. That was a remarkable, remarkable season for all of those guys, and it'll be awesome to see. A couple of them move forward to 2025, a couple of them move on to the NFL, but it'll be awesome to see what happens next year, and definitely will be a star-studded group. And let's talk about that a little bit. Let's get into the top 10 quarterbacks as we head into 2025. Who could be the quarterback on that All-American team at the end of the year? Definitely a very interesting group. Some groups that are very experienced and inconsistent. Some groups that are very, very talented but very young. So we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back in, everyone. We just got into my All-American team for this year. Very tough group to put together, and a lot of those groups that are about as tightly knit as you can possibly find. Some groups that are incredibly, incredibly hard to find those 3 or 2 guys that you want, but feel pretty good about the group that I had, and we'll move on to the 2025 season a little bit. Let's talk about the quarterbacks as we get into the 2025 season. Insanely tough list to rank, if I'm being totally honest with you. I think there's a lot of different guys that are going to be incredibly, incredibly tough to deal with, and I think there's a lot of guys that are really experienced, a little bit inconsistent. I think there's some other guys that are incredibly talented but not so experienced, so it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Yeah, Anthony, I do agree with you. I think the All-American linebackers have to be guys that are very kind of consistent in that run game, and there's not so many guys that are overly consistent. I think Danny Stutzman's the kind of A tier of all of that, and definitely a guy that I think would be leading the way in a lot of ways in that linebacker group. But as we head into the 2025 group with the quarterbacks, I think you have to start with, I think this group is pretty solid. I think the 10 guys that you rank are relatively solid. Now, there is some leeway here where you want to pull one guy out, throw one guy in, maybe a Kevin Jennings into this list or something like that. I would totally understand it. But I think when I look at this group, the 10 that I have are roughly the 10 that I would rank, and then you could put them in roughly any order you wanted, if I'm being totally honest. So try to keep projection out of this as much as possible, but let's be honest. As we head into 2025, there's going to be some projection. There's going to be some things that you just bet on the athletic ability, the ability of some of these quarterbacks to carry them, and that kind of is the story for the number 1 guy, or the number 10 guy here. Arch Manning is my number 10 quarterback as we head into this thing, and I think it's going to be up for debate, and I think there's big-time worries here. There's no doubt about that, but you look back at the 3 games that he played throughout the year, whether it was UTSA when he came in and lit the world on fire, he played Mississippi State, played some really great football, ULM was probably C+ football, and I think it was one that really showed some of the worries of him, where he definitely missed some reads to go throw some deeper balls that probably weren't all the way there. He definitely does some things that are kind of relying on that ability to carry him and can put himself into precarious situations. So it'll be a really interesting thing to watch. I think he has all the ability in the world to end this list on the very top of the list at the very end of the year, but overall, the experience and the decision making are questions as you head into the year, but he's definitely a guy that I couldn't leave lower on this list. He's absolutely elite in every sense of the word, and definitely a guy that I think is going to light the world on fire. Still some questions out there, but it's hard to bet against this guy right about now, given what we've seen. Nico Iamaleava is my 9 quarterback going into 2025, and he's a guy that you just have to get that offensive line working. He's a very talented kid and definitely can make all the throws in the world, and when he is rolling, he looks about as good as any quarterback you'll find across the country, but I do think when you look at the downfield accuracy, it's not quite to where it needs to be. And that Tennessee offense, while, they're going to run the ball, and that's where they're going to kind of make their money, they got to hit those downfield passes. If they do that, they can become not only a great offense, but one of the most dangerous offenses in the country, and it's got to be this guy leading the way. He's going to have to take over in a big-time way because Dylan Sampson is walking out the door, incredibly, incredibly talented back that gave you a lot of leeway in last year, so definitely going to be a guy that needs to take a big step forward, but the ability is out of this world, and definitely a guy that I think is going to be remarkable in 2025, and will be really fun to see what he can do, but needs to take some big steps forward, especially in that downfield passing game. Sam Levitt is my number 8 guy. I saw someone ranked him number 1. Not necessarily sure I can get on board with that, but he is a guy that I would love to lead my team. He definitely has the energy that you very much need, and I think he's one of those guys that brings an edge to a team that needs it in a lot of different ways, especially with Cam Skattebo walking out the door. You need a guy to lead the way with a little bit of edge, with a little bit of energy. I think this is definitely the guy to do that. Now, there is some questions about his elite level passing ability, and I have the same ones. I think you look forward to next season, I think there's a lot of things to like about this kid. I think there's also some reason to think that maybe he'll take a little bit of a step back. You don't have that security blanket that was Cam Skattebo in this year, and you're going to your redshirt sophomore year. Could be a year that he very well explodes, becomes one of the best players in the country. Could also be a year that he takes a little bit of a step back. So I'm a little bit torn on Sam Levitt. I think the talent is absolutely clear and definitely going to be a guy I'm going to watch very closely. But I think as you head into next year, you got to have questions about this group, especially without Cam Skattebo right next to him. Carson Beck is my number 7 guy. He is a great quarterback. I understand that there's a lot of people that will say a lot of different things about Carson Beck, but you take out those 4 middle games and you can't. But at the end of the day, if you do take out those 4 middle games, he was really impressive this year. He did not throw a pick in the final 4 or 5 games in the season. He's a guy that the question is the injury. There's no doubt about that, and definitely will be interesting to watch that over the next 4 or 5 months, but definitely a guy that could find his way back to a number 1 or round 1 draft pick. Not sure if he can be number 1, but definitely a guy that could really burst onto the scene and make some really huge plays. I think you look at what Shannon Dawson can bring to that guy. Definitely going to need the offensive line to step up a little bit more because he's definitely not a guy that handles pressure quite as well as Cam Ward does, but at the end of the day, very talented kid. If he can get healthy at the right time, then he can do some really incredible things for Miami. John Mateer is my 6th quarterback. He's going over to Oklahoma from Washington State this year, and he's a guy that's going to be really awesome to watch. Now, Oklahoma has a lot of issues, so it might not matter all that much. As upsetting as that is for a lot of Sooners fans out there, I think you look at one of the most electric players in the country, but the O-line is going to be a problem. The wide receiver talent is going to be a problem. Now, it could be a little bit better than I'm thinking of it right now, but definitely going to be a group that you're going to need to get the most out of. So the question is about the supporting cast. It's not necessarily about this quarterback, at least in my mind. I think you can do just about everything he did at Washington State, at Oklahoma. it's going to be a little bit tougher. Those SEC defenses are going to be coming at you pretty quickly, and that offensive line of yours does not necessarily look like one that's going to protect you for too long. So it's going to be interesting to watch what he can do. I think he can build off 2024, but it might just come down to the people around him as much as it comes down to him. Drew Aller here at number 5. I think this is a guy that I go back and forth on a lot of different ways. I think there's a number of things to like with him. There's a number of reasons to believe that he could be a number 1 overall pick in 2026. He has all the ability in the world. He's obviously built like an NFL quarterback at 6'3", I believe, 215, something like that. Very talented kid that can do everything you possibly want him to do. There are some issues with inconsistencies. There's no doubt about that. There's some issues with some big-time games where he's kind of shrunk away from the moment. So it's going to be interesting to watch what he does in 2025. It feels like a year where everything can really start clicking for him. I felt like this year was kind of that you're getting there, and then next year maybe everything falls into place and he becomes one of the very best quarterbacks in the country. So it's going to be awesome to watch what he can do in 2025. I'm still a little bit nervous about some of the issues that he's had, but overall cannot deny what he can do on the football field. And Anthony, you make a good argument. I think Carson and John Mateer are very, very even. I think you look at both of them, very different styles of quarterback, but I'll lean John Mateer because of the running ability and because of the non-injury. But overall, I think they're about as even as you could possibly have. I love DJ Lagway. This one is a little bit of projection, but I'm more than happy to die on this hill because I think the ability is out of this world. We saw what we saw at the end of last year where he beat LSU, where he beat Ole Miss, and he's ridiculous. He's a guy that obviously makes some mistakes as a young quarterback would, but the arm strength is absolutely insane. The arm talent is ridiculous, and you look at what he can do going into 2025, there's going to be a lot of things on his plate. There's no doubt about that. There's going to be a lot of things that he's going to have to deal with and he's going to have to handle, and a lot of them are going to be because of his head coach. You know, he's going to be the guy that Billy Napier ties himself to for the rest of his career, and it's going to be interesting to see if he can deliver in 2025. So a lot of pressure on this kid. There's no doubt about that, but I think you look at the ability, it's about as good as anyone in the country, and it's hard to deny what he can do in 2025. Lenora Sellers is my number 3 guy. I think you look at all the quarterbacks across the country, very hard to find a quarterback that was playing better football in the back half of the season than Lenora Sellers. I think an absolute freak athlete and someone that is taking real strides forward throughout the season, passing the football, and especially downfield, passing the football has been very effective throughout the year, and it's going to be awesome to see what he can do in 2025. I think he could outright steal the Heisman, if I'm being totally honest. I think he could be a very, very dangerous player and definitely be someone that, even without Dowell Loggins and now bringing in Mike Shula, I think it's going to be a really, really ridiculous offense. And I think Lenora Sellers can very well lead that. I think he could very well be the Heisman in 2025. He's a very talented kid and one of those guys that South Carolina's just waiting for that last thing to click. If it does, Lenora Sellers could become one of the most dangerous players in the country. And then you're looking at South Carolina possibly making a CFP run at the very end of this thing. Cannot say enough good things about this kid. And another one kind of like DJ Lagway that's a little bit of projection, but cannot deny the ability of this kid. Garrett Nussmeier is my number 2 guy. I think this is a guy that's as good as anyone in the country. When you look at the passes that he can make, very few guys can make them as consistently as he can. Now, the issue that I do have is the turnovers. That's a very real thing, and it's got to be ratcheted back a little bit next year. Now, the one thing you don't want to do is ratchet it back all the way and lose all the ability that he brings, because some of his ability is pushing it into windows that are a little bit tight for some people, and Garrett Nussmeier has the ability to throw into. So, very talented kid. The pocket mobility of this kid is downright special. He's one of the best pocket mobility quarterbacks in the entire country, and definitely a guy that could very well be the number 1 overall pick going into next year. I cannot think higher of this kid. There are some worries when you come down to the turnovers and some things that really do put him behind the 8 ball, but overall I think a lot of things could click for this kid in 2025, especially if that offensive line gets moving, and then you're staring down a group that it's going to be really hard to stop offensively, and a guy that it's going to be really hard to stop on his way to a possible Heisman Trophy. And then Cade Klubnik. This is the best quarterback in the country going into 2025 as far as I'm concerned, and he has all the confidence in the world to throw the football when he needs to. He has the mobility that is absolutely a huge plus, and then the experience where you very much need it. Now, the worry is definitely the consistency. Like we talked about Anthony, there's a lot of different things to talk about with this kid and a lot of different things that you do worry about. You know, when he played Georgia, when he played Louisville, when he played some of these teams, he didn't necessarily look all that great. Now, I do think the Texas game was a little bit of a flip of a switch. Now, obviously, you'll never really know until he gets on that field in 2025, but I think he could very well steal the show. If that offensive line gets fully in order, I think he could be absolutely incredible, and it's going to be awesome to see what he can do in this year. I have him as the best quarterback in the country going into next year, but frankly, I think there's a good argument for a number of the guys on this list to make that number one spot. But this is a group of either really young, really exciting players like Arch Manning, like DJ Lagway, who, Anthony, you could very well put him at 10. I think when you rank these guys, all 10 of them, you could put in a number of different orders. Now, if you were to drop Garrett Nussmeier, Cade Klubnik a little bit lower, then maybe I'll disagree a little bit. But at the end of the day, I do think it's a group of 10 that you can play around with a lot. And DJ Lagway is one of those guys that it depends on how much you buy in. Obviously, I'm buying in a ton. Definitely some people that are a little bit more wary of what Florida is going to be overall next year, but a very interesting group. I know you have the young, exciting, talented players. You have the inconsistent veterans, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with this group, but it's going to be a race to see who finishes number one, who probably is the number one overall pick going into 2026, and it's going to be awesome to watch all these quarterbacks go at it. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we'll get into some transfer portal talk. Let's talk about all the different things happening with the transfer portal. We'll get into all the little details, all the things happening after the national title, because Notre Dame's losing quite a few offensive linemen, but we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about my top 10 quarterbacks as we head into 2025, a very tough group to put together. I think you have very talented young players. I think you have kind of inconsistent veterans in that group that you could rank any which way, if I'm being totally honest, but I like the 10 that I have at least. If you want to play around with that list a little bit, more than welcome to, but let's get into the transfer portal, a little bit of updates after the national title, because there's definitely some fallout from that group and definitely some other things that I want to make sure you guys are updated on. Probably the last full segment we'll do around the transfer portal, but at the end of the day, definitely some big time things happening in the winter cycle as it comes to an end. And we'll start with the national title kind of fallout, because there were some definitely big things that came out of this national title, and we'll start with Notre Dame. That was kind of the biggest thing, was the O-line room this last day. Definitely a lot of the guys jumped in there. A couple of guys that are not so big of a deal. Definitely some guys that are going to be a little bit bigger a deal down the road, and those are those two guys. I think Pat Coogan and Rocco Spindler going in yesterday are going to be really interesting guys to watch in the portal. Two guys that I think a lot of SEC teams will be in for these two. I think Texas will be a team to watch for Coogan, as well as Georgia, as well as maybe LSU, Tennessee. So a lot of teams that are going to need that offensive line help. Both these guys are multi-year starters. I think they're going to be very effective on whatever team they find next. Now, how it affects Notre Dame, I don't know if it hurts too much, if I'm being totally honest. You talk about the depth they have at the offensive tackle position and really the interior position with Rocco Spindler moves on, probably going to be Anthony Knapp that moves into the tackle or the guard position, and then you have the tackle with Emil Wagner and maybe Jagusa. So going to be interesting to see what happens with that offensive line for Notre Dame. I don't think this is a death march by any means. I don't think any more guys are leaving, and I don't think these guys left for any other reason that they probably weren't going to play quite as much as they played this year. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Definitely some guys that you didn't want to lose if you're Notre Dame, especially Pat Coogan, but overall I think it's going to be a group that's going to be more than fine going into 2025. And then another name to watch is Jaden Thomas, a wide receiver for them that's very, very physical, very talented kid, a kid that I like a lot. And then Auburn and Cal are the two teams to watch. Sounds like he's set up visits at both those places over the next week or so. This is going to be a very great piece. I think if you add him to Auburn, I think he could be an awesome piece on the outside blocking concepts. And then for Cal, that guy right there, actually, Devin Brown over at Ohio State made his decision. He is off to Cal to be the starting quarterback there. I assume the starting quarterback there. And then you had George Fitzpatrick, the offensive lineman, Mitchell Melton, one of the defensive players, go to KSU and Virginia respectively. not necessarily huge names. Walking out of Ohio State, there will be plenty of huge names that we'll talk about with the NFL draft with them. So overall, not necessarily hit huge, super hard if you're Ohio State, but Devin Brown throwing to Jaden Thomas would be something to watch over at Cal in 2025. And as of right now, it's probably where I bet on if I'm Jaden Thomas. We'll see what happens in that group, and definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. Those offensive linemen for Notre Dame are two that we'll talk about probably next weekend, see where they end up landing, because definitely some teams that need some offensive linemen right about now. And then you got some fallout from the past couple of rounds, and Omari Evans is kind of the main one among that. Washington gets a very nice pickup here, and I did misspeak yesterday. I totally forgotten that Jeanty Cook has left the Washington program. They have parted ways after about 48 hours when he was there, so a little bit of an interesting situation there. We'll talk about Jeanty Cook here in a second. Not sure where he's off to, if I'm being totally honest, but Omari Evans, a great pickup for Washington. Definitely a guy that can really stretch the field for them, and I think Damon Williams just needs guys. You have Denzel Boston already there, who's a huge player for them, but you need a guy that can really stretch the defense. That's going to be this guy. It's going to be really awesome to see what he can do in this team, and I think you look at what he did at Penn State, I think you're just scratching the surface. He's obviously a guy that moved over to wide receiver this past year, and I think that the ceiling is still very well above him. His teammate was Harrison Wallace, and he found his way into the portal and over to Ole Miss. He's going to be an Ole Miss Rebel going into 2025, and a huge pickup for this team that just needs pieces around Austin Simmons at quarterback. I think you have a number of guys that are going to be very talented in Caden Lee and a number of other guys that you've picked up, but this is definitely a very nice pickup. I don't necessarily think he's going to light the world on fire by any means, but I do think he's a guy that can really fill in some gaps for you and help out where you need it. Not necessarily be the light the world on fire guy, but definitely be the guy that makes a couple of plays throughout the year and is a very nice complementary piece to your offense. But overall, very solid pickup. Ole Miss just continues to do their business in the portal. Then we'll get to Jeanty Cook. With him leaving Washington, I don't really know where he's off to. And frankly, he's probably going to have to wait until after spring, which puts him behind the 8 ball. No doubt about that. And I think it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. He's not going back to Texas, I can almost promise you that, but it'll be really interesting to watch where he ends up, and very talented kid. There's no doubt about that. You wish it would have worked out a little bit better for him at Washington and really better for him at Texas in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, very talented kid, and wherever he ends up, he can be a player in 2025. It might have to wait a little bit longer than he would like, though. Thaddeus Dixon, a guy that is actually leaving Washington as well, going over to UNC. This is probably the biggest pickup that they've had throughout this portal cycle. Very physical, very smart DB that I think can really work in a Bill Belichick, Steve Belichick type system. Very talented kid, and definitely one that UNC badly needed. You know, this portal class for UNC was a good group. It was a group that I think was going to elevate their game just a little bit, but you needed that game changer on defense in a lot of different ways. I think you have Camion Rucker on the front side. I think you now have Thaddeus Dixon on the back end, and it's going to be really awesome to watch what he can do this year. I think the talent level is really ridiculous. He just got to get in the right system, get in the right place, and really start hitting his stride, and he might have just found it at UNC, if I'm being totally honest. Star Thomas is the guy that I really like. I think Tennessee got a huge one here, and we'll get into some of my favorite portal pickups next week because definitely some guys that I really want to highlight, and this might be one of those guys, if I'm being totally honest. Over 1,000-yard rusher over at Duke last year, and I think he can be very dangerous in that Tennessee offense. Very talented guy that I think just hasn't burst onto the scene because of where he was playing. He won't be Dylan Sampson. I can almost promise you that. He won't be quite to that level next year, but he absolutely will be a great player and definitely is a great piece for Tennessee to pick up at this late in the process. Anthony Evans is a guy that I want to talk about here. Mississippi State continues to get my favorites throughout the portal. I think there's a guy that can make a ton of big-time plays, whether that's in the punt return game or in the pass game. He's a huge downfield threat, and I think you look at Luke Kromenhoek, the talent, the arm talent is very, very obvious. He can absolutely hit this guy, and I think it could be a very special connection in 2025. He's a guy that I think Georgia probably should have unlocked just that little bit more throughout the season on the offensive side of the ball, and I think Mississippi State is going to have essentially no choice but to unlock him on that side of the ball. Then I do have Damon Wilson here. I think Missouri needed this one very badly coming off the edge. A very talented kid coming out of Georgia. Sounds like Texas made a late push. Ohio State was very firmly in this one, but it sounds like Missouri won the NIL battle in this one. So huge for Eli Drinkwitz. Definitely a win that they very badly needed, and a guy that is going to start for that team. I can absolutely promise you that, especially with Williams Nowari walking out the door. You got a guy that's going to walk in here and definitely compete for one of those starting jobs and maybe burst onto the scene in 2025. Very talented kid that was stuck behind some ridiculous players at Georgia. It'll be interesting to see. Excuse me. It'll be very interesting to see what he can do in 2025. And then you got Emmanuel Pregnon, a very talented offensive lineman, and Oregon's done work at the offensive lineman position. Picked up Isaiah World, the offensive tackle, and now gets a guy on the interior that can be a huge bunch of help. I think this might be the best of the bunch. You have two guys that are coming up from the group of 5 level at offensive tackle. Now you have kind of that anchor in the center of that offense. Very talented kid, and definitely a kid that could really burst onto the scene in 2025 and end up being an offensive lineman, maybe first rounder at the end of the next year. The top transfer portal pickups, will do a little bit of a wrap up here before we end this thing off. And Carson Beck, John Mateer kind of set things off. The quarterbacks in this group are really fun. I think you look at Carson Beck and John Mateer, you see two very consistent, two very smart, two very veteran quarterbacks. And then Luke Romanhoek, the young star that could really develop into something special. I think he's a very, very young player. I realize I put FSU there. He's going to Mississippi State. Apologies for that. But very talented quarterback that absolutely will be a very talented player for Mississippi State. Will he hit his stride in 2025? I'm not necessarily sure about that, but definitely will be a very talented player, and I think in 2026 could be one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC. Then you have the wide receiver talent that was just all over this group, but especially in the top end, you have Eric Singleton and Deuce Robinson here, a duo that's about as good as you'll find in the country. And then you got Nick Anderson. You got a number of other guys in the back end. Barry and Brown, another one that really did some incredible things throughout this year. And the wide receiver talent was very obvious going in, and it's been incredible to watch those number of guys come off the board. And Auburn picks up, I think, their wide receiver 1 for 2025. I think FSU does the exact same thing. And then you got Damon Wilson, Prince Will Emmanuel, and Patrick Payton that are kind of leading the way defensively on this one, and elite players. There's no doubt about that. I think Patrick Payton is going to be one of the better edge rushers in the entire SEC next year, and I think when you look at Emmanuel and when you look at Wilson, two very talented guys that I don't think has hit their ceiling by any means. So going to be really interesting to watch what those guys can do. Really talented top of this class, and I think you look beyond that, still some very talented guys. And then Patrick Kudos, one that Ole Miss very, very badly needed from Arkansas. And then the top 10 classes as we kind of close the book on the winter portal. LSU leads the way. Ridiculous what they've been able to do. They needed the offensive line. They needed the back end, and they did that in no uncertain terms. Josh Thompson comes in from Northwestern. You have Mansour Deline. You have Jakeem Jackson. Very talented players that absolutely will help out this defense. And then Ole Miss is doing what they're doing. No doubt about that. Texas Tech will be one to watch to see if they have any holes as you head into spring. And then Auburn, Miami doing some big-time things. And definitely some teams that will be really interesting to watch how those portal guys fill in initially, because lost some big time guys on all those teams. And then Kentucky doing kind of a stabilizing year that I think could be a really fun group. I don't necessarily think it's going to be a great group by any means, but definitely will be an interesting team to watch. You have Florida State, needs to hit in every sense of the word. Same thing with Nebraska. And then Missouri is a team that didn't necessarily have the year that they wanted. They very badly need to turn a corner in 2025, and we'll see if they're able to do that. And then A&M has done an incredible job at the wide receiver position. Definitely going to be a team that's going to be really awesome to watch. But overall, this is probably the last time we'll really get into the winter portal, and we'll obviously revisit it at some point. But overall, it's going to be really awesome to watch what happens with these last couple of guys, especially the offensive linemen over at Notre Dame. And then it's going to be awesome to watch, what else happens in spring, because we are not nearly done with the portal cycle throughout this year, and we'll see what happens in that spring portal cycle. For the winter one, we're pretty much closing the book. We'll obviously update you once those offensive linemen have made their decision, once a lot of different things have come off the board. But overall, it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch as we go throughout spring, and you have to imagine there's going to be some explosive in spring as well. But we'll take our last break here, and when we come back, do a little bit of a wrap-up at the end of the week. We have Al Golden getting hired by the Bengals. You have the NCAA hitting Dion with a violation. You have the ACC looking for a new conference title, and a couple of different things that we'll talk about right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just got into the transfer portal, kind of our last wrap up for the winter transfer portal. Definitely a lot of things that really went crazy, especially that wide receiver group. Going to be a very interesting thing to watch as we go throughout spring. But let's get into kind of a weekend wrap up here. Definitely some things that I want to get into as we go into the weekend. And we'll start with that big time hire that the Cincinnati Bengals made in Al Golden. Al Golden has been hired by the Cincinnati Bengals away from Notre Dame, and Notre Dame is officially on the market for a defensive coordinator. They joined Penn State, Oklahoma, a couple other teams that are still on the prowl for what their DC is going to be, and a lot of them are going after Jim Knowles right about now. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. We'll talk about that next week. It sounds like Penn State put a lot of money on the table for possible Jim Knowles getting Jim Knowles. But overall, for the Cincinnati Bengals, they got a very good defensive coordinator. There's no doubt about that. 14.3 points per game, second in the country, was only gave up 298 yards per game, top 10 in the country. They were elite. There's no doubt about that. Definitely a group that was very, very talented, and a group that was very obviously good, well coached. They made just about every single tackle in front of them, had very, very few coverage breakdowns, even against a team like Ohio State, where played incredibly good football, but you had Jeremiah Smith, you had Emeka Egbuka on the other side. That was the reality of that game, and overall, I don't think it's a huge indictment of Al Golden by any means. So I think it's a solid hire by Cincinnati. He goes back to the place that he was there before Notre Dame and had done a great job there with the linebackers. He finally comes back with that DC position and makes a little bit of sense. There was a lot of quiet out of Cincinnati the last couple of weeks, and it was because they were waiting on this guy to finish the job. So a very, very talented coordinator. We'll see what they do at Notre Dame in that position. We'll see what Penn State does, if they can pick up Jim Knowles, if Oklahoma can find a way to do that. There will be a lot of different things that will be really interesting to watch as we finish off this coaching carousel, but there's obviously one more twist to it, and it could have a couple more, depending on what happens with that Jim Knowles character. Deion was hit with a little bit of a recruiting violation from the NCAA. It sounds like he was live streaming on the Deion Sanders coaching show, and he had 2 episodes where he discussed Juju Lewis, the very talented quarterback that has now signed with the Buffaloes. He was talking about him before he signed with the Buffaloes. So relatively minor violation in every sense of the word. Colorado self-reported it. Not a big deal, if I'm being totally honest. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from this. Now, Deion Sanders will have to we'll have to attend additional rules education sessions, and we'll have to do an imposed reduction in 4 in-person recruiting days during the 2025 spring contact period. Now, I think we all understand that Deion Sanders doesn't do a ton of home visits now. He started to do that just a little bit more, but obviously will not be a huge deal for him. Overall, this is not necessarily a thing that we need to talk about too much. Definitely something that will probably get a little bit more run than it probably should throughout the next couple of days, but he's done an incredible job there. Obviously, there's a little bit of a misstep. Not a big deal by any means. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and if there's any more fallout from this or there's any more violations that come from this, but as of right now, it does not seem to be a big deal by any means, and seems to be that Deion's going to be more than fine heading into next year. The ACC is possibly changing their conference title, and it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here. It might have everything to do with what the CFP does this offseason and next offseason, because it sounds like that's what they're kind of gearing towards. So the idea, as it sits right now, is you would have sort of a play-in game. You wouldn't have a conference championship. You would have a play-in game between the numbers 2 and 3 teams in the conference, and then you have the number 1 team, the regular season champion, would remain idle. They would move on to the CFP. Obviously would not incur the penalty possibly that SMU might have gotten from that Clemson game. The number 1 team wouldn't have to worry about that in the ACC going forward. This would probably only happen if the ACC got, let's say, 2 auto bids, while the Big Ten and SEC got 3. So this is probably a 2026 and beyond problem, but I hate this. I'll be totally honest. I hate this with every fiber of my being, if I'm being totally honest, because conference championships should be conference championships. We should have a way to contextualize this the correct way and not bury teams for playing in them, but still put a lot of emphasis on them. It shouldn't be necessarily a super tough thing to do. For some reason, people are making it very, very tough. So this is something that was going to be talked about, changing up the conference championship. If you wanted to do a little bit of a tournament with the top 4 teams, then maybe I could get on board with that, but then you're just adding another game to these guys' schedule. But overall, I think there's a thing that I just hate. When you add more and more things that are going way, way towards the CFP and saying that our conference championship doesn't matter at all. It just matters who makes it to the CFP from our group. It's a very, very bad thing. And it's definitely a thing that can roll downhill very quickly and become something that we all hate in a lot of different ways. So I dislike this a lot of different ways. I hate the fact that you wouldn't have a conference championship and SMU would have been the champions of that conference, but as we saw, Clemson was able to beat them, so Clemson was the champions of that conference. So I hate this. I hope this does not happen. I think it probably won't, depending on the way that things go in the next couple of years, but at the end of the day, conferences have to still mean something. Conference championships still have to be conference championships, and I really won't budge on that, if I'm being totally honest. Now, there are some things that we can talk about as we go on the next, iteration of this playoff, depending on how it plays out. We'll see what happens there, but overall, you got to keep emphasis on these championship games. And I think you move it to a 2 versus 3 matchup, you're going to have way less people watching, you're going to have way less interest, and you're going to have two teams that are fighting for a CFP spot, but they're not fighting for anything other than that. They're not fighting for the conference championship that they can take home. That's already in the hands of someone else. So I don't think it's a very good idea. I don't think it's an idea that I would back by any means, but it is also an idea that I understand where they're coming from in a couple of different ways, because if they're going to put all the emphasis on the CFP, you might as well do that at the conference level as well. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. I don't like it by any means, but I can't say that it's not something that I can't say it won't happen by any means. So that'll be a very interesting thing to watch, and definitely something that I'm hoping doesn't happen, if I'm being totally honest. Bill Belichick officially signed his contract yesterday, and there were some worries about this. Probably shouldn't have been all that worried, if I'm being totally honest, but the deal has a ton of incentives in it, has a ton of different things that could possibly make him one of the highest paid coaches in the country. A 5-year deal, pay him $10 million a year annually. Obviously, a lot of the different incentives in there will bump that up just a little bit more, and definitely some great things within that. Now, the big thing that we did talk about earlier is a $10 million buyout right now. After June 1st, it'll be a $1 million buyout. That'll be an interesting thing to watch. Throughout 2025, he will be a name talked about with the NFL jobs. He will be a name talked about with probably other coaching jobs as well in the college football world. It'll be interesting to watch this one unfold. I don't necessarily think he's going to be at UNC for a very long time. I think he's going to be a guy that probably there for a year, maybe 2, but at the end of the day, very, very talented head coach, obviously, and definitely a guy that it'll be really interesting to see how this unfolds. He did an incredible job, obviously, in his NFL career. This is obviously a little bit different, no doubt about that, and that'll be really interesting to watch. He's off to a relatively good start in the recruiting world, in the portal world, but definitely some things that he's going to have to figure out as he moves forward, and it'll be really awesome to watch this unfold. I think all of us are very interested to see what they can do. Also, another thing for UNC is their home opener against TCU will be on that Monday night, so they'll get that Monday night game. I think they wanted that to be a little bit standalone with Bill Belichick, so makes total sense. Will be awesome to see what he can do in 2025. Beyond that, I have to assume he's probably going to be somewhere else. If I'm being totally honest, probably back up in the NFL, but maybe not. Maybe he's hanging out in Chapel Hill, and maybe some special times are coming that direction. Then we have the Xavier Lucas situation. He is enrolled in Miami. He is no huge update from Wisconsin, and frankly, I don't think you're going to get one over the next couple of weeks. I don't think there necessarily is much to be said at this point. The NCAA has said that no rules were violated in terms of the transfer portal. There are some things to talk about with some different contracts were signed, but let's be totally honest. There's not a lot of enforceability in the NCAA right now. There's not a lot of things that you can really enforce in the college football level. So I don't necessarily think this is going to be that big of a story after a couple of weeks, if I'm being totally honest. I think this is going to be something where Wisconsin and the Big Ten figure out pretty quickly that they're probably not going to win this battle, and even if they do, it's probably going to give them a bigger headache than it's worth. You probably just let the guy walk out the door, and they did, and obviously a very interesting situation, one that probably doesn't incline a lot of guys to really go to Wisconsin and lean into them, but it'll be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. But overall, it's not going to be a story in a couple of weeks if I had to imagine. If it is, then maybe Wisconsin has a little bit more evidence than I'm thinking of right now in the tampering part of this, but I don't think they do. And even if they do, I don't think teams want to go after teams for tampering really that much, because they understand the game. They understand that they're taking part in that just as much as everyone else. So I don't think anything's going to come from this one. If I'm being totally honest, I think Xavier Lucas will play for Miami, and he'll be a very talented player for them. So as much as we'll focus on the outside stuff, this is a very good piece for them, and definitely a guy that I think could be on the field very early for Miami. And then let's talk about the CFP title. I said ratings, excuse me. But the ratings for the national championship did suffer this year. Got down to 22.1 million. It was the most watched CFP game. It was the most watched non-NFL sporting event this past year. The problem with that is just this past year, the Michigan-Washington game was up near 25 million. So you got a problem. There's no doubt about that. And there's definitely some things that need to be figured out with this thing. I think the biggest thing is just the scheduling of it all. I think a lot of people woke up on Monday and said, oh, yeah, there's a national title today. That should never be the way that we go about it. It should always be counting down the days till that game officially happens. Felt like we lost a lot of momentum between that number, that's between the 10th and between the 20th. I feel like we lost a lot of juice in the college football season. They're going to have to find a way to kind of condense this thing back down just a little bit more. It'll be interesting to see what they do over the next couple of years. Probably won't be until 2026 where we see a couple of these things kind of come into effect, but it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. People are a little bit less interested than they were before. There's a ton of different reasons why some people are uninterested. NIL, transfer portal has definitely hurt some of the fans' interest, but at the end of the day, I think you're going to get plenty of people if you really lean into this thing, if you make it the A-plus product that it absolutely can be, and get a little bit closer to that 25 million that you very much like to be at, and maybe get up from there. There's some really incredible games. You go all the way back to 2014, that was about 34 million. So there's definitely a tapering off. There's no doubt about that, and definitely something that maybe we'll get into a little bit more detail next week, talk about the real trends and definitely some things that are worrisome. There's no doubt about that. So we'll talk about that and definitely get into that in a little bit more detail next week. But overall, I do think it's a scheduling issue. I think the engagement of regular sports fans really kind of tapered off between the 10th semifinals and the 20th championship. You're going to have to find a way to keep the attention. So probably a little bit less time, probably a little bit more intensiveness on those games, and probably just moving a little bit quicker throughout the CFP. But that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Definitely something that they're going to have to find a way to figure out. Now, I've never been one that really cares too much about ratings. I'm watching the game. If I enjoyed the game and enjoy the players that are on the field, I have no problem. But I understand this is a business. I understand how this works, and you're definitely going to need a little bit more from those ratings as you move forward throughout the rest of the next couple of years, especially into possibly an expanded playoff format. But going to be really interesting to watch all of this unfold, and we're officially into the offseason. You turn your page onto the 2020 or on the 2024 season to the 2025, and we'll get into all the details on that with spring camp, with quarterbacks, with all the different things to watch as we get into spring camp. We'll get into some freshmen to watch next week, but at the end of the day, that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people covering every single sport you could want. So anything in the world of sports you need, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday.
Mm-hmm.